This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. One day at school, 7-year-old animal-loving Georgia discovers her best friend is wearing a coat made with mink fur. With the companionship of her dog Tizzy, Georgia and her friend begin to learn about animals that live in fur farms and that they must stand up for them. Tizzy and Me, 15 Ways to Love a Mink is a lovely chapter book by NML Hazard, also known as Dr. Nadja Lubiw-Hazard, a former veterinarian turned author. Published in late 2024 by Red Deer Press, with illustrations by Alice Priestley, Tizzy and Me is a wonderful story for young people and families who want to discuss issues of animal welfare, talking about difficult topics, and making an impact for animals in our lives. To discuss her unique background, what went into writing Tizzy and Me, and what she hopes people learn, along with some great writing tips, Defender Radio is joined by Dr. Nadja Lubiw-Hazard.
Before we get to Tizzy and Me, I think it would be interesting to hear more about your story. You are a veterinarian who got into creative writing, and you've obviously done very well for yourself with it, but that journey is very interesting. So I was wondering if you could share a bit about how you went from A, or you started at A and ended up at B.
Yeah, and there was actually a middle thing in there as well. So I grew up as an animal lover. Like, I just always loved animals, and I always loved reading. Those were like my two childhood passions. And so it seemed sort of obvious that I would become a veterinarian. That seemed like the right career path. I went to vet school. It was actually quite traumatic for me. I kind of expected everyone to be, animal lovers, to be vegetarian, and it was the opposite. In fact, I got introduced to vivisection, which I really didn't understand until then. Factory farming, there's a big part of veterinary medicine that is agriculture. It was really difficult for me. I graduated, I started practicing, and I found the career very difficult. One, because it's a business. So there's always those financial decisions, and there's also euthanasias that are based on finances, and that's really hard. It's a emotionally difficult career. For me, I also found some anxiety in all the decision-making and the life and death aspects of things. So when I had my children, I actually stepped away from practice. And so I was like a full-time mom for a little while. And then I started working in education because I just enjoyed my kids so much, and I enjoyed seeing how they learn things and how excited they were about learning things. And so I have worked in education for a long time, and I still do. And then I kind of had like my little midlife crisis, and I was like, what do I want to do with my life? And I was like, oh, I would like to write a novel. So I set out on this writing pathway. During that time, I also went back into practice. I worked at the Humane Society for several years. And I really enjoyed it, especially working for a nonprofit rather than working for a business. That was really great. And working for an organization that had the same politics as I did. So that was really meaningful as well. But then when the pandemic hit, the position I had went online, and it just wasn't working for me. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to, and I also at the same time got a very large grant from the Canada Council. So that was like a little turning point where I was like, okay, I'm going to focus on full-time writing. And that's kind of how I got here.
Yeah, that's a great journey too. That's a very interesting in and out, and it is something I've heard from many people in the veterinary world at all layers of it, because there are a lot of different positions within that. But that difficulty in wanting to be there to help, but the business aspect of it and the unfortunate reality of healthcare for anything or anyone is that there are ends to it all, and that's difficult. And there is a capacity point, I think, for most people for that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, is that part of what informed you when you decided to write Tizzy and Me, or was there a different inspiration behind that?
Well, the original, so it's very interesting because Tizzy and Me actually goes back more than a decade. So I wrote the first Tizzy and Me story when my children were younger. And it was really just a story about a family with two moms and a dog that they adopted, and sort of the shenanigans that the dog got up to, and the sort of wrong things that the dog did. And the little girl, Georgia, sort of, having to learn what it is to have a dog and how to care for a dog and how to forgive a dog that, rolls in goose poop and, chews up your running shoes and all those little things that happen with dogs. So I tried to get that one published and I didn't. But I did get good feedback. So it was kind of like an almost there, but didn't quite make it. So I wrote another one, another Tizzy and Me adventure. And this one, Tizzy was a superhero. And that one also I sent out and got good feedback, but didn't get published. And then during the pandemic, as you know, minks were in the news a lot because of COVID and the relationship to minks and the fur farming, and fur farms being, shut down and the animals being culled. And it was really on my mind. And then I just started to think about, my character, Georgia, what would she think of all this? And that's kind of where the inspiration came from. So the story is actually, this little girl who discovers more about what fur farming is and is really appalled by it all, and then does something about it.
Is this something that you feel was you were able to speak to specifically and provide it in such a way, the information about mink and about fur farming, to children? I mean, you've got that very unique background that you've just recently described. Do you find that helped you be able to take this very, at times, dark, complex, upsetting concept of fur farming and what happens and make it accessible to young readers or families? Do you think that was really a part of your background, or did that come from the writing work you did? Because you did do a lot of extra educational work around your writing, which is great.
Yeah. I think the thing that most influenced that was being a mother, raising my daughters, and how I explain things to them. So I'm vegan and I raised my children vegetarian. And my partner's vegetarian. And, we had a lot of conversations about what happens to animals. And, I talked to them a lot about different issues. And so, you have to, when you're speaking with children, I believe you need to be honest, but not graphic. You need to explain things at a level that they understand. You need to explain things in a way that the reasons make sense to them, so you're not going to get into big, sort of moral and ethical conversations. It's really more about, the basics of things. And then I do think, being a veterinarian, one of the skills that we develop is an ability to take complex material and simplify it, make it sort of easier to understand. So rather than doing like that doctor speak at people, when I worked with clients, I really wanted them to engage and understand what the issue was, what the solutions were, what the options were. And, I think that was hard at first because we're not really taught that.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes people even like to sort of, appear like they know things and talk in a certain manner that way. But I do think that was a skill that I developed. So I think, a lot of things went into that for sure. And then, as you said, as I wrote more and more and more, I became a better storyteller as well.
Yeah. And that's, I think, always the advice I hear from writers, and probably the advice I give as a news writer, is my background, is just write more. And then when you don't know what to write, go read for a while, then come back and write some more.
100%.
Yeah, it's the best way forward. And I think it's interesting. Do you find that having that, I don't want to call it a shell, but sort of that backbone to your story? So you've got the family, the two moms, you've got a lot of this already set up, as you said, before you ever got to the mink aspect of it. Do you think that allowed for the family aspects of this story to have a lot of strength to it, so that when you introduce the difficult subject matter, there's a balance already in place?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, as you said, write more, and you learn as you go. I think the first Tizzy and Me story that I wrote actually didn't have it didn't really have sort of a rise and fall. It didn't really have a story arc. So it was the family, and it was the dog, and it was the relationship between the family and the dog. But there wasn't really like a big crisis or a big conflict. And so that was one of the things that I learned as I wrote more and wrote more. And you're right, I already had like this really strong base to start from. I knew the characters, I knew the family relationships, I knew the dog that they had. And so then it was this great layering of this really interesting story around, what happens when you have conflict with your friends, what happens when you learn about something that upsets you, what does it mean to, take action when you're a child and maybe don't feel like you have a lot of power. So, I think there was a lot of backbone in place before I even got started writing this third one.
And I find it interesting too. You talk about introducing these ideas to children and others in a way that they can understand, make it accessible to them. And I'm curious because one of the things we talk a lot about in this field of ours is the anger that comes along with this. And there's a lot of different takes on what to do with that anger because it's real and we can't deny it. We can't shame it. It's a very real, visceral response to seeing some awful stuff. But I find it very encouraging in your book that you talk about how Georgia, the main character, and her friends start an animal kind club. So it was an interesting read in that regard to me of this is upsetting. Are you going to be upset and stay upset, or are you going to do something positive to try and balance that out in the world? Is that something that you think is an important message at this stage, or is there sort of a place to be talking about anger in other ways?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I'm thinking to some earlier parts in the book where Georgia gets really upset and she kicks a chair, and the kicking of the chair scares the dog, and she runs upstairs. So there is that expression of anger, but I think one of the things we can do with our anger is to channel it into more sort of like less reactive and more responsive ways to deal with things. And so I kind of like that we initially have this very visceral reaction of anger, and then later that turns into something that is more positive. Yeah.
It's wonderful to hear. And I'm curious, talking more about the mink side of this and the fur farming side. What was your research process like? I mean, you obviously are going to have perhaps an easier time getting at the depth of information available with your background.
Yes.
What was it like for you going through that process? And were there things that surprised you along the way?
That's a great question. I certainly agree with you that like I can read complex scientific information and absorb it, but I did have the fur bearers and your fantastic website, which was filled with information that was condensed in the way that I needed it. I'm trying to think what things surprised me. I guess the thing that surprised me was just how obvious it seemed once I was researching fur farming and the relationship with COVID and with epidemics. And even right now, I think you just had a very recent post about the link between the avian flu and the fur farms. And so the surprise for me is just that fur farming still exists. I guess like that's truly what I'm most surprised about. It seems like, I mean, with lots of other issues, there's a lot more complexity to it, whereas this one seems like a real simple, like, okay, let's stop this activity now. This is harmful to the animals. It's harmful to the environment. It's harmful to people. It's a disaster waiting to happen in terms of another epidemic. Let's just, take action now. So that was the thing that surprised me. One of the things that happened very early on when I was researching was I was looking up minks and just fur in general, how people used fur, I guess. And I came across this article, and it was 15 ways to wear a mink, wear it as a stole, wear it with your jeans, wear it this way and that way. And I had a little epiphany, and I was like, okay, instead of 15 ways to wear a mink, what are 15 ways we can save the minks? And so that was a big part of the story. And it came by, me discovering that and wanting to subvert it a little bit. And so it took a while to figure out a way to make it into 15 unique things that we could do, that children could do, that anyone could do to help minks, but it came through.
Yeah, absolutely it did. And I think that's, again, talking about writing, one of the great tips is if you have an idea, write it down. If you don't write down an idea, it doesn't exist. That's my rule. So that's exactly the kind of thing, though, where it's you read something or you think something and it just clicks.
Yeah.
And you grab that opportunity and run with it, and you end up with something pretty impressive.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that creative process. I love the way that, our brains can grab onto things and then it kind of follows all these different leads or tangents and it gets tangled up with other things that we've read and suddenly something new emerges. And I just find it fascinating watching that happen. I love being creative. I love the way that it makes me feel when I'm in a really creative space, how I kind of lose sense of myself and
Yep,
lose sense
the
of
flow.
time. And I'm just really in the zone, like really just flowing with creativity and writing. And I just love that feeling. So, writing brings me a lot of joy, too.
And on that note, what role do you think storytelling is going to play in advocacy, sort of ongoing? And we can be very general about it or specific to an issue like this. But what role do you see there for storytelling specifically in the way you've done? Do you think it's an important part of the overall efforts?
Yeah, I think it's pretty essential. I think we are storytellers and we respond to stories. And I've read some fascinating books just around, the storytelling animal, which we are, and why we do this and how we need it, and how essential it is to being alive, to being a human. Is this acts of creation and storytelling and story making, and it comes out in many ways, of course, right? But in terms of animal activism, for me now, I think my writing is the biggest advocacy that I can do. And, I do a lot of writing for adults, much more so than for children. So I have many, many short stories I've written and a novel, and there's always an animal theme to them. And I think it's the best way to introduce a theme by making it personal and connecting it to a character and connecting it to a character's journey through life. I think that's really essential.
Well, and it's a great way to create empathy through experience that can be shared in a sense that way, right? It's one thing for you or I to have experienced something, know about it, and that becomes a truth for us. But to be able to share that in a way that's accessible, I think is exceptionally important, and a wonderful talent and skill you have that really does have a rippling impact for many, many people. So it's a great thing to hear as well. That you get joy out of it. I mean, when you can combine those things, it makes for an unstoppable force of change.
I like that.
And speaking about fur farming a bit again, I'm curious, sort of, if you've spoken a lot about it from the writing perspective. I'm curious for how you would see it through a veterinary lens, because that's something we don't hear a lot when it comes to animal agriculture, particularly fur farming, is veterinary voices or people in that field speaking about it. So I'm curious, sort of, for your perspective through that lens of it, but then also a bit about maybe why we don't hear more about it from others in the field.
Yeah, why we don't hear more about it? That's a really great question, and I'm not even sure I can answer it. I know, from my experience in vet school, that sort of an animal rights stance is not common in the veterinarian field. So that I think is part of it. There's a lot of status quo, vets. And then I guess what I'm thinking about, what I brought to it as a vet was simply seeing it through George's eyes. So sort of seeing it through her relationship with her dog. And, as a veterinarian, one of the things that I would think about is, what does this animal need? Like, how can I help this animal and keep this animal happy and comfortable? And so in terms of mink fur farming, when you look at all the aspects of it, it's just, there's no needs that are being met. There's, the issue of space for an animal. There's the issue of appropriate substrate, like what the flooring is made from. There's the issue of having a place to hide or withdraw from. There's an issue of being able to engage in natural behavior. So for a mink, swimming, climbing trees, moving around. There's the issue of relationships with other minks. How would they live naturally? What sort of territory would they have? How would they interact with other minks? So when you start to tease it apart and think about, the basic rights and freedoms that each animal should have, mink fur farming and factory farming, agricultural farming, it's so deplorable because of the lack of the lack of compassion for the animals, the lack of understanding of what they need, and how to give those things to them.
One of the first things I learned about mink when it came to fur farming was that they have a natural solitary lifestyle, and they only really get together to breed. And they'll have territories that they roam in a day that's over 1 kilometer long, I think. And you think about what that's like for this little animal, and then you put them in a box the size of 2 shoe boxes. And it just, it is so wildly unnatural. There is no way for them to be a mink in that situation.
Yeah, I agree. Like wild animals in captivity suffer so much, and it's because we take the wild away. So, I'm thinking of like polar bears, for example, one of the worst animals to keep in captivity because of how far-ranging they are. They're meant to travel many, many kilometers. They're meant to live in a very cold environment. And I think of, them, I did some work with ZooCheck, and we worked for a long time on a campaign with a polar bear named Yuppie, who was in a Mexico zoo. Concrete floor, hot environment, small space. It's just terrible. And you're right. You kind of take away the wildness of them when we do that, when we put them in that kind of confinement.
What do you think are the biggest barriers to changing public attitudes about fur farming overall?
You know what? For me, this one seems to be that people don't know. Because I've been sharing this story and telling people about writing it. I've had people say, "Oh, I don't even know what a mink is," and I certainly think a lot of people don't realize the status of fur farming in Canada and how many fur farms we have. And for me, it seems like ignorance is a big part of this one.
Yeah, that's unfortunately true, I think, with a lot of issues these days, and speaks to at times the overwhelm many of us have of the amount of information that we can take in a day. If you read the news every day like I do, it's just that alone is enough to fill you up for the day, let alone anything else that you're going to learn about. So it's certainly one of the harder parts of pushing through, I guess, that narrative and that noise. But that's where a book like yours ends up playing such a significant role, because it's not pushing through the way that other things are trying. That's really poorly phrased. It's not targeting people the way that a lot of campaigns do. It's a very natural children's chapter book that happens to speak about this issue in an accessible way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's not didactic in any way. It's not moralistic. It's not trying to, teach people about this issue, although it does. It's a story about friendship. It's a story about family. It's a story about conflict. It's a story about activism. It's a story about education. Like, it's a story about a lot of things. But primarily, it's a story of this little girl and what she does when she discovers something that upsets her, and her role in trying to, make the world just that little bit kinder. That's really what it's about.
Do you have any other animals or topics you're thinking about writing about in the future?
Oh my gosh, so many. so many. So I've written so many manuscripts for children, picture books. And so these are some that I have written, but I also have ones that I plan to write. So I've written about zombie worms, which are this really unique worm that only are found on whale falls, which is when a dead whale falls to the bottom of the ocean floor, creates this unique ecosystem. So I've written about them. I've written about vultures, which I love vultures, and I know they're really maligned. People think really terrible things about vultures, but I think vultures are amazing creatures. And, you know, they eat the leftovers. You know, they don't even eat living things. Like me as a vegan, I'm still eating living things. I'm still eating plants and thinking about the relationship with that. Whereas with vultures, they're such peaceful creatures, right? They don't hunt. They don't eat other animals that are alive. They don't kill. So they're really peaceful creatures. I have a big plan to do a historical fiction novel based on the Brown Dog riots. That's really my big project. You've heard of that? Yeah?
I have not. This is the Brown Dog affair?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's my quick internet Googling there.
Yeah.
But please share. This is actually something that I think a lot of people would be interested in.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of research for the novel already. And so the story is about two women activists in the early 1900s in England. They're very active with a lot of social justice issues, but they are very passionate about animal issues. And they enroll in medical school so they can actually see what's happening. And they encounter vivisection, but they also encounter there's one particular dog, the brown dog, who is not anesthetized properly. And they have broken the sort of the rules at the time, or the laws of the time around the vivisection that's allowed. And so they publish this diary of all that they've encountered in their medical school. They go and view all these different scenarios in medical school. And it turns into this enormous thing. There's a trial that takes place. There's a great conflict between people who are anti-vivs and people that are pro-vivisection. And it's at a time when vivisection was fairly new and was sort of exploding in the medical world. A statue was erected in memory of the brown dog, and then there were riots around the statue.
Wow.
And then the statue was secretly torn down in the middle of the night after it had been up for 4 years. So it has all the makings of a fantastic story. And so I'm looking forward to telling it. But it's challenging for me because I've never written historical fiction. And I actually find it a little bit hard to be stuck to the truth of the story. I'm so used to making up the story and just making things up as I go. Like, I'm not really a plotter when I write. I just, fly by the seat of my pants. I write what comes, and the next day I'll be like, oh, well, maybe this will happen now. So that is the struggle for me right now. But I do look forward to getting back into that project.
Well, yeah, and publishers listen in on that one, definitely, because that sounds great. And it's interesting because that probably, I would imagine, ties back to your time, as we talked about, as a veterinarian and sort of encountering all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And the difficulty that exists to this day in people within that field speaking out about these issues and being able to then maintain work and not face any consequence. Yeah,
absolutely. I felt such a kinship to these two activists. It was like me 100 years ago. That's what it felt like.
Yeah.
Vet school, for example, there's so many examples that I could give you, but I remember, I think we were in third year and we were learning CPR, and we were in small groups, and the instructor brings a healthy dog, and she says, well, there's two ways we can do this exercise. We can recover the dog after the exercise, or we can get more out of the experience and the dog will be dead at the end of the exercise. And we were to vote. And so we voted. There was, I think, 4 of us, and the vote was tied. So the decision was made that the dog would be euthanized at the end. And so we take a healthy dog, put it under anesthetic, give it medication so that it goes into cardiac arrest. We then have to try and save this dog. And for me, I was in such an emotional panic at this point. Like I absorbed nothing of what I was supposed to learn during this activity. And then the dog is dead at the end of all of it. And I thought, this can't be right. This cannot be an educational tool that is supposed to help us learn how to save an animal. It was, a really pivotal moment for me. And it was really life-changing, encounter, it wasn't just that I saw vivisection, I had to participate in vivisection.
Yeah.
And that was really horrific for me. And I still am recovering from it. I still feel guilty sometimes. I feel ashamed sometimes that I didn't do more at the time. The connection to these activists speaking out against vivisection is very strong for me.
Well, and I hope you consider writing some memoirs at some point too, because those would be exceptionally compelling stories. I recognize that it's easy for me to say that as the one who didn't go through the trauma of it. But I also, as an avid reader and someone who likes talking about this stuff, that again would be a very powerful story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've written I'm not that. I feel like I'm not that good, or that's not really the right word. Maybe I don't have the skill or the talent for writing nonfiction. I often try, and I find, I don't know, I get self-conscious, and I feel like that self-consciousness shows up on the page. But I have written one nonfiction piece about my time at vet school, and it was published in Room magazine, which is a Canadian literary magazine.
Awesome. And I guess for people who are interested in learning more about what you're doing and your other writings, where can folks find out more about what you are doing, what you have done, and what's next?
Yeah, so the main other thing that I've published is a novel for adults. It's called The Napaway Motel. It's not particularly animal rightsy, but there are a lot of animals in it. There's a litter of kittens. There's imaginary wolves. There's a vegan character. So, there's a lot of sort of me woven into it, I guess I would say. But I do have quite a few stories, short stories that are published as well. And the best way to find those is with my website, which is www.nmlhazard.com.
To find out more about Dr. Lubiw-Hazard, find copies of her books and other writings, or get in touch with her, visit nmlhazard.com. You can find Tizzy and Me, 15 Ways to Love A Mink in your local library or bookstore. And if your local library doesn't carry it, consider donating a copy. I had a lovely time chatting with Dr. Lubiw-Hazard, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Remember to follow Defender Radio on Instagram at Howie Michael, Blue Sky at Defender Radio, and on Facebook. And to subscribe and follow the podcast wherever you listen. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers, reminding you to stay informed and stay strong.